introduction, and thanks for giving me this platform to talk about quasielastic neutron scattering and a particular example of its use to study oxide ion diffusion in a solid electrolyte. The talk will consist of two parts. First, I will give a general introduction to neutron scattering, why we do it, some basic information about the theory, and instruments that can be used for quasielastic scattering. The science example is a study of dynamics in a bismuth oxide type oxide ion conductor using quasielastic scattering to investigate the nanosecond and picosecond dynamics and complementary computational results. Neutrons are a really good probe for the bulk of materials. They interact with the nucleus instead of the electron cloud, and therefore can penetrate matter quite well. This also means that neutron scattering can be done in complex sample environments, for example, in situ measurements, in cryostats and pressure cells. The interaction of neutrons with matter is weak, which is particularly beneficial for soft matter because it's a non-destructive method. Neutrons also have a spin and a magnetic moment, which means that it can be used to study magnetic structures. The wavelength and energies that can be accessible with neutrons are comparable to interatomic distances and excitations, which means that with neutrons we can study both the structure of the materials and excitations like vibrations, librations, and relaxations. Another great advantage or specialty of neutrons is their cross-section. The cross-section sigma is the likelihood of an interaction between an incident neutron and a target nucleus. This cross-section, as opposed to the interaction with X-rays, varies randomly across the periodic table. This means that we can distinguish neighboring nuclei very well sometimes, and we can probe light elements in the presence of heavier elements. For example, neutrons are especially sensitive to hydrogen, and the cross-section also varies with isotopes, which allows us to use hydrogen and deuterium to create contrast, highlight or hide particular features of a structure. To talk more about neutron scattering, we first have to cover some scattering basics. When a neutron strikes a material or a sample and leaves in a new direction, that's what we call scattering. The incident neutron has an initial momentum and energy Ki and Ei, and after scattering, the final momentum and final energy Kf and Ef. These quantities allow us to define the momentum transfer Q as the difference between the initial and the final momentum, and the energy transfer omega as the difference between the initial and the final energy. With this, we can then differentiate elastic scattering, which is scattering with just momentum transfer, no energy transfer, and gives information about the structure of a material, and inelastic scattering, which is both momentum and energy transfer and gives information about the dynamics or excitations in a material. The quantities we actually measure in a neutron scattering experiment excuse me, is the number of neutrons scattered per second into the solid angle d theta with a final energy EF between EF and EF plus DEF. This is called the double differential cross-section. The double differential cross-section is proportional to the dynamic structure factor SQ omega. SQ omega depends on the momentum transfer Q and the energy transfer omega, and it therefore contains all experimental information. This equation here is only is only valid if we have a single isotope with a zero nuclear spin in the system. This is, well, generally not the case, which means that the reality of neutron scattering is more complicated. And a second contribution to the dynamic structure factor appears, which is called the incoherent dynamic structure factor. The coherent scattering depends on the mean scattering lengths, whereas the incoherent scattering depends on the variance of the scattering lengths. So if we have a random variability of scattering lengths in the sample, for example, through isotopes or nuclear spins that are not zero, then the incoherent contribution arises. This is quite a complicated part of neutron scattering to explain briefly, and therefore, if you're interested, I can highly recommend these two textbooks for a nice derivation of the equation. However, what's important for us are the practical consequences of coherent and incoherent scattering. Coherent scattering is when scattered neutrons from different nuclei interfere. It describes collective behavior and spatial correlations, for example, the elastic signal from the structure. Incoherent scattering, on the other hand, is the phenomenon when scattered neutrons from different nuclei have random relative phases and there is no interference. Therefore, incoherent scattering gives access to individual behavior and self-diffusion, like self-correlation. This is quite important for studying QENS of proton conductors or hydrogen diffusion in general, since hydrogen is a very strong incoherent scatterer, which means that QENS can be used to study the self-diffusion of hydrogen. Now that we've established these basic terms for neutron scattering, we can start talking about quasielastic neutron scattering. QENS is an inelastic scattering that is centered at zero energy transfer. It is associated with diffusional behavior and occurs due to processes with a distribution of energies, where the final state has the same energy as the initial state. QENS can be used to study dynamic processes like rotations and translations. Quasielastic neutron scattering is a very useful probe for all sorts of dynamics, either localized or long-range diffusion, and it's applicable in a lot of fields of current research, material science of matter, biology, chemistry, and so on. A very big advantage of QENS is that it accesses the same time and spatial scale as molecular dynamic simulations, which means that QENS can be used to validate theoretical models, and vice versa. Molecular dynamic simulations can be used to aid in the analysis of quasielastic data. Due to the large incoherent cross-section of hydrogen, QENS is particularly useful for studying proton dynamics, but it has also been very successfully applied for other ionic conductors or other elements like oxygen, lithium, and sodium diffusion, which is particularly interesting for battery materials. Here you can see a schematic diagram of the results you might obtain from a QENS experiment, with the elastic line as a delta function at zero energy transfer, which broadens into a Gaussian due to the finite instrument resolutions. Inelastic scattering is at larger energy transfers, and centered at zero is our QENS signal, which shows as a Lorentzian with a certain half-width of half maximum, and this is called the QENS broadening. This broadening of the elastic peak, the Lorentzian, can give us information about fundamental processes. For long-range diffusion, the angular dependence of the half-width of maximum can give us information about the details of the diffusive process. At small q, so long distances in real space, Brownian diffusion is dominant. But as you move to larger Qs, so smaller distances in real space, individual jumps become more important. This means that at large Qs, we can differentiate different types of diffusion. For solid-state diffusion on a lattice, there are several models, two of which are the Chudley-Elliott model and the Hall-Ross model. One of them, the Chudley-Elliott model, describes only nearest neighbors jumps on a lattice, whereas the Hall-Ross model includes a normal distribution of jump lengths. And as you can see, the behavior of the half-width of maximum at large Q between the models differs. Therefore, by fitting these models to our data, we can extract diffusion coefficients, jump length, and residence times of the diffusing atoms, as well as get an idea of the diffusion pathway. If the diffusion is local, so spatially restricted diffusion, the half-width of maximum will not show a very strong Q dependence. However, in this case, we can use the elastic incoherent structure factor, or EASF, and its angular dependence to extract information about the localized dynamics. The EASF is the ratio of elastic intensity and elastic plus quasielastic intensity. It depends on the space accessible to scattering atoms, and can, for example, there are models for jump diffusion between different numbers of sites, which is shown in this plot here. For example, the EASF varies if you have 2, 3, or 4 equivalent sites available. There's also models for diffusion on the surface of a sphere, in a circle, or a volume of a sphere. And therefore, fitting the EASF allows you to get information about the space accessible to the scattering atoms and distances between the nearest neighbor sites or radius of the sphere. Here, I want to show a general overview of neutron scattering methods. There are many different techniques. The ones relevant for neutron spectroscopy are shown in the colored squares in the middle, while below the horizontal axis, there's purely structural models, for example, suns and diffraction. For neutron spectroscopy, we can cover a very large range of length scales as well as time scales using time-of-flight spectroscopy, backscattering spectroscopy, and spin echo spectroscopy. There's also a lot of complementary techniques, for example, dynamic light scattering or NMR, which are quite commonly used to get a big complementary picture of the behavior in a system. For quasielastic scattering, we can use time-of-flight spectrometers, backscattering, and spin echo. And in the next few slides, I will explain very briefly how these techniques work. So first, starting with time-of-flight spectrometers, the generally time-of-flight spectrometers give access to a lower energy resolution than the other spectrometers, and therefore we can access faster dynamics, like on a picosecond timescales. The resolution can be varied, which makes time-of-flight spectrometers a very versatile instruments. And we can access a broad range of energies and wave vectors and obtain maps of the SQ omega space. Here I'm showing a schematic diagram of a time-of-flight spectrometer at the ILL, IN5, which uses a monochromatic beam, which is pulsed by these choppers, and it hits the sample at a certain time. It then is scattered and moves, the neutrons fly to the detectors, where they are measured, and the time of flight can be determined. This gives us a three-dimensional spectrum of the detector position, X and Y, and the time, which can be converted to the dynamic structure factor. If the dynamics are slower and a higher energy resolution is required, backscattering spectrometers are commonly used. The achievable energy resolution is in the in the region of 1 microelectronvolt, which allows access to nanosecond dynamics. In these instruments, as opposed to time-of-flight instruments, the resolution is fixed by the instrument, and generally the dynamic range is limited. The way these instruments work, I will explain by the example of ion 16b, a backscattering spectrometer at DLL. We have an incident neutron beam, which is directed to a monochromator. The monochromator is mounted on a Doppler drive, which allows us to change the velocity of the monochromator. Using the Doppler effect, the d-spacing which the neutron beam encounters varies, which varies the initial energy of the pulse. The neutrons are then directed towards the sample, where they are scattered, flying towards the analyzer crystals. However, just as for the monochromator, only neutrons with a wavelength of 6.271 angstroms are backscattered to the detector. Therefore, the time at which they hit the detector depends only on the initial energy, and so the energy transfer can be determined. One disadvantage of the higher resolution is that it comes at the cost of a reduced flux. So it's always a bit of a trade-off between signal strength and resolution. However, there is a third technique, neutron spin echo spectroscopy, which allows us to reach an even higher energy resolution without losing the neutron flux completely. It gives access to very slow dynamics in the tens of microseconds, and it uses the spin of the neutron. Here is a schematic diagram of how a spin echo spectrometer is laid out. The velocity selector selects a range of wavelength in the order of magnitude of 10 with 10% monochromaticity. So it's much less monochromatized than for the previous instruments I discussed. The neutrons then move through a first magnetic field where they start to process. They then hit the sample, and after which there is a second equivalent magnetic field, but pointing in the opposite direction effectively. And therefore, if there is no energy transfer, the polarization of the neutrons is fully regained. However, if the neutrons lose or gain energy at the sample, the time spent in the two magnetic fields are not equivalent, and the polarization will decrease. And this is what is measured in this in neutron spin echo spectroscopy. Importantly, neutron spin echo measures in the time domain and not the energy domain as the previous instruments are showed, and therefore the data looks a bit different. But since for the practical examples, I will talk about time of flight and backscattering spectrometers, I will not go into more detail of spin echo data. So now that we have a background on neutron scattering, I would like to move on to an example of QENS being used to study oxide ion diffusion in a solid electrolyte. Oxide ion conductors are solid metal oxides with highly mobile oxide ions. This is an effect of defects in the crystal structure, for example, either vacancies where an interstitial atom moves into an adjacent vacancy site, or an interstitial atom can move into an adjacent interstitial site, or the third mechanism, the interstitiality mechanism, describes an interstitial atom replacing a lattice atom, which then moves into a free interstitial site. Oxide ion conductors have a large market potentials. They're relevant materials for membranes, fuel cells, and oxygen pumps, for example. But current oxide ion conductors require very high operating temperature, which limits their commercial potential. One of the more interesting and remade relevant applications of oxide ion conductors are as electrolyte in solid oxide fuel cells. Solid oxide fuel cells can be used for energy generation and conversion, and therefore provide a green alternative to the combustion engine. The electrolyte, however, is generally a limiting factor because it's quite a thick part of the fuel cell, and ionic conduction in solid state is generally slow. And it's therefore quite important to find oxide-ion conductors with a high ionic conductivity at lower temperature. The best oxide-ion conductor we currently know is the delta phase of bismuth oxide. It adopts a fluoride crystal structure with interstitial oxygen vacancies. The fluoride structure you can see here, but only 3/4 of the tetrahedral holes are occupied by oxide ions. This leads to the very high ionic conductivity, but unfortunately the delta phase is only stable in a very narrow temperature range. However, we can stabilize the high temperature phase at low temperatures through doping. And the two materials I will be discussing for the rest of this talk are such doped bismuth oxides, vanadium and a phosphorus doped bismuth oxide. For simplicity, I will call them BVO and BPO respectively. These two materials are isostructural, so they adopt the same monoclinic ordered fluoride superstructure, which you can see here, consisting of two sublattices each, a bismuth oxygen sublattice and a dopant sublattice. The main difference between them is that vanadium readily supports variable coordination environments, whereas phosphorus has a strong preference to stay tetrahedral. We also know from impedance measurements that the vanadate has a significantly higher ionic conductivity by almost an order of magnitude than the phosphate. Therefore, these two materials are a great opportunity to study the effect of the dopant on the localized and long-range diffusion. To directly observe the diffusion of the oxide ions, we used iron 5 and iron 16B, so a time-of-flight spectrometer and a backscattering spectrometer. However, when measuring QENS on oxide ions, there are some limitations. The diffusion is generally quite slow, and especially complicated structures like this monoclinic structure I'm working on has many Bragg peaks in the range which is accessible through the spectrometers. Therefore, the signal is weak, and to allow us to extract the QENS broadening, we summed over Q values where the Bragg peaks were not present. In recent years, QENS measurements on oxide ions and on oxide-ion conductors have become more widespread because the fluxes increase and the detector precision increases as well. So we have better instruments available to measure at a very high resolution. First, as I explained briefly before, we carried out experiments on iron 16B to investigate the nanosecond dynamics. One of the first measurements you do on iron 16B is generally fixed window scans. This gives an overview of the timescale at which the dynamics enter the resolution of the instrument. First you measure elastic fixed window scans, which is just the Bragg intensity of the elastic peak at increasing temperature, and the inelastic fixed window scan, which is measured with a certain offset of the elastic peak. For us, it was 2 microelectron volts. And generally, you'd expect a sharp decrease of the elastic intensity at the same temperature as the inelastic intensity increases. Our elastic fixed window scans don't show a very clear, strong decrease as we expected, but the inelastic fixed window scans show clearly that at around 400 degrees Celsius, the QENS broadening should be strongest. We therefore measured both samples at 300, 400, and 500 degrees Celsius. The spectra we obtain are, you can see here, the scale is logarithmic, but nonetheless, the QENS broadening is very small. But we could still analyze it. The analysis was done, as I mentioned in the introduction, with a convolution of a delta function and the resolution to account for the elastic peak, and a Lorentzian for the broadening. This allows us to obtain the half-width of maximum or full-width of maximum of the broadening, and the temperature dependence of this is related to the activation energy which causes the broadening. For BVO, we obtain an activation energy of 0.16 electron volts, which is in great agreement with NMR data and suggests that on iron 16b we're observing dynamics in the bismuth oxygen sublattice. For BPO, however, the temperature dependence was very weak, so we were not able to extract an activation energy from this. To look at dynamics on a different timescale, we went to iron 5, which allows us to observe picosecond dynamics. On iron 5, we measured more temperatures, and as you can see, increasing the temperature significantly increases the broadening we observe. The data was fitted the same way as the iron 16b data, with a convolution of the resolution and a delta function for the elastic peak and a Lorentzian for the QENS broadening. The data for BPO looks very similar to this and was treated the same way. From this, we could obtain the activation energy of the picosecond dynamics. For BVO, we found this to be 0.08 electron volts, and for BPO, 0.03 electron volts. Again, this is in great agreement with NMR data and suggests that on iron 5, we observe dynamics in the dopant sublattice. So just to give a brief recap of our experimental data, we have measurements or data from iron 5 on a picosecond timescale and iron 16b on a nanosecond timescales. They agree well with NMR data, but due to the weak signal and the many Bragg peaks, we were not able to investigate the Q dependence. Therefore, we don't know yet from the experimental data what the nature of our dynamics is. To overcome this problem, we moved to ab initio molecular dynamics simulations. As I mentioned in the introduction, molecular dynamics in general and ab initio MD as well operate or give access to a comparable time and length scale as quasielastic neutron scattering. The advantage of ab initio molecular dynamics is that it provides atomic level detail and is predictive, so you do not need to make assumptions on the diffusion pathway. But it is based on density functional theory, DFT, which means that it's very computationally expensive, and it's not feasible to reach nanoseconds of simulation time or simulate very big structures. We simulated both BVO and BPO using the software WASP with a simulation box of 286 atoms, which is already pushing the upper limit of what is feasible, a total of 400 picoseconds and 6 temperatures per compound. Here you can see an example of the type of information we can obtain from ab initio MD measurements, or MD measurements in general, where each cloud represents the space visited by one particular oxide ion during the course of the simulation. This is the data of BVO at 500 degrees Celsius, and we can see a rotational motion around a vanadium cation. We can see movement of an oxide ion from the bismuth oxygen sublattice into the vanadium oxygen sublattice, and we can see long-range diffusion in the bismuth oxygen sublattice. As a first sanity check, we looked at the average coordination number during the simulations. Since the main difference between the materials is that vanadium readily supports variable coordination environments, whereas phosphorus doesn't, we expected the coordination number in BVO for the vanadium atoms to change significantly. This is the case, as you can see, both at 500 and 1100 degrees Celsius, where for BPO the average coordination number of the phosphorus atom stays close to 4 during the whole simulation, whereas for BVO it reaches, it's an average of 4.12, which means that 2 out of 16 vanadium atoms in the structure are on average 5 coordinate. With this we wanted to see if we can directly compare our simulated data to the experimental data obtained on iron 5. We therefore used the resolution we had on iron 5 to simulate the S of omega, and fitted it exactly like we did with the experimental data, using a convolution of resolution delta function for the elastic peak and a Lorentzian for the QENS broadening. Again, the data for BPO looks very similar to this. I'm just showing one example to not repeat myself too much. From the temperature dependence of the full width of maximum from the simulated data, we could again extract the activation energy. And a very good agreement between experiments on iron 5 and simulated activation energies make us quite confident that what we observe in the simulations is the same process that was observed on iron 5. We therefore tried to analyze the simulations in more depth, which was not possible with our experimental data. For example, we could look at the elastic incoherent structure factor, which gives the information on the geometry of the localized motions. To make the analysis a bit more a bit easier, we separated the oxide ions into oxide ions originating in the bismuth oxygen sublattice and those originating in the dopant sublattice. And a very clear ESF trend for those originating in the dopant sublattice can be seen. Initially, we tried to fit this using a jump diffusion between 4 equivalent sites, since we know that the structure is generally tetrahedral. However, we found that diffusion on the surface of a sphere represents our simulated data much better. The radius of the sphere we obtained from the fit of the ESF is in good agreement with the expected vanadium-oxygen distance. And looking at the space visited by the oxide ions, we can see that it looks very spherical. For BPO, the agreement between the model of the surface of a sphere diffusion is even better with the experimental data, and the radius of the sphere and the bond distance agree very well. Since the phosphorus atoms have a stronger preference to be tetrahedral, the spherical description fits this better than for the BVO even. So now from this and the good agreement with the iron 5 data, we can say with quite strong confidence that what we observe on iron 5 are the rotational motions in the dopant sublattice. Our simulations are unfortunately not long enough to directly compare them to iron 16B measurements, since this would require us to simulate nanoseconds of data. However, we can still get an idea of the oxidizer mobility from the simulations by looking at the mean square displacements. Generally, the mean square displacement, here shown for BVO, increases with increasing temperature. To analyze this in a bit more detail, again, we separated the oxide ions into oxygen atoms originating in the bismuth oxygen sublattice and in the dopant sublattice. For BVO, at 500 Kelvin, the oxygen atoms from the vanadium oxygen sublattice reach a plateau at about 5 angstrom squared, which is the distance around the the rotational distance around the vanadium center. As you increase the temperature, the slopes become more comparable, which can be explained by the exchange between, there's more hops between the two sublattices, making the distinction between the two sublattices less meaningful. For BPO, the mean square displacements look very different. At all temperatures, the MSD curves for the oxygens in the phosphorus oxygen sublattice plateau at around 5 angstrom squared, which shows that the oxygens around the phosphorus centers do not contribute to long-range diffusion, and all long-range diffusion in BPO is caused by oxygens in the bismuth oxygen sublattice. From the mean square displacements, we could obtain diffusion coefficients, and again, the temperature dependence of the diffusion coefficients allows us to obtain the activation energies. These are in quite good agreement with impedance data. Most importantly, the lower activation energy of the vanadate compared to the phosphate is recreated or reproduced very well. To conclude on this experimental study, we could observe QENS on both a nanosecond timescale on 916b and a picosecond timescale on 9.5, observing jumps in the bismuth oxygen sublattice as well as rotational motions in the dopant sublattice. The ab initio simulations are consistent with the 9.5 data and reveal the localized nature of the dynamics. In general, I think this shows quite nicely how simulations can help and complement the experimental data, especially for systems where the QENS signal is difficult to analyze, like oxide ion diffusion. And as a general conclusion on quasielastic neutron scattering, I hope I could show that it's a very excellent technique to measure diffusive dynamics. You can study dynamics in all sorts of materials, from condensed matter to soft matter, under all sorts of conditions, as long as the desired time and length scales are accessible through the instruments and the scattering cross-sections are acceptable. QENS can give us information on the length scale or geometry of the diffusion. There are many analytical methods available, and it's particularly useful for studying hydrogen diffusion. Thank you for your attention.